Hey everyone, it is Deflating Atheism here, and I'm joined with a fresh face, with someone you haven't seen before on my channel, which has been a while since we've done that. Ken Ammi, will you please tell us who you are? Come on down!
You're the next contestant. Yes. Well, I'm glad to be on with you. And I guess contextually, I've been interacting with atheists online for over a decade. I mean, like regularly. So I've had discussions with literally thousands of them. And it kind of, an atheist tells me, you should actually listen to what we atheists are saying to understand this. I'm like, bruh, as the crazy kids say nowadays, bruh. I've interacted with thousands of atheists, literally thousands.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I'm unaware. It's just that one of my points, I guess, is look, if atheists want to make a bed, I'm going to demand that they sleep in it. And they do not want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
They just, they'll smoke and mirrors. They'll bring the, hey, how about this? How about that? It's anything to avoid the actual issues that are inconvenient to their chosen view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I was kind of similar to you. I was the keyboard warrior for many years, and that's why I said, well, all these comments, I'm putting hours and hours into these comments, and they're just washing out with the tide, into the mists of time. Then I started doing this channel to maybe put it in a more semi-permanent state. But yeah, I kind of figured out that the comment battles really weren't worth it. But what were the platforms you were using?
Well, so I'll give you a little tip about that. I pretty much use anything and everything. I mean, like when a brand new social media site gets started, I'll jump on it. I mean, I'll use anything that's available. So social media sites, YouTube, just the standards, Facebook and Twitter and anything. But one thing I realized is, as I'm having a discussion, every time I go and post, I copy their latest reply and I'll copy my reply to them and I'll paste it in a document. So I have a record of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then once the discussion's done, I'll post it on my website because I figured I'm not going to do all that hard work.
Yes.
And invest all that time to just have it be in a corner of the internet or disappear. So I end up posting them on my website as just kind of examples of discussions. And so one way it paid off is there was a site, you essentially don't hear about it anymore because it's just so horrendous. It's called Ex-Christian, right? So I was having a discussion with maybe 10 different atheists in a comment section. And all of a sudden, the admin of the site wiped out the whole comment section, just deleted it and locked it. Well, guess what? I had the whole discussion saved. Same with Raphael Lataster. He was supposed to be the big up-and-coming atheist mythicist, Jesus mythicist. He was going to be the new poster boy. And basically, he apparently disappeared after he published a book or two because his claims were so horrendously bad. But again, with him,
let me guess, it was self-published thing on Amazon.
Well, I don't know. Neither would I fault him on that. I mean, I self-publish. So, but what I was saying is on Facebook, I was having a little discussion with him and same thing happened.
Yeah.
The admin just locked the comment section and it disappeared. Well, guess what? I had it and now I published it in one of my books when I published Historical Jesus books. So I found that's kind of a way to kind of make sure things don't disappear or just are off into a little corner of the internet where nobody will ever find it.
Yeah. So you're really going into the belly of the beast. You're not just using Facebook. You're battling them on their own turf.
Yeah, wherever I might happen to find them. Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is just kind of an aside, but the rare time I actually used the Deflating Atheism Instagram account to actually talk to an atheist, they demanded I give academic citations in the Instagram Instagram comments. Do you know how difficult it is to write anything in Instagram comments?
Because apparently, if you include an academic citation, then you're infallible.
Well, yeah. Well, there's also the issue: have these people ever so much as touched an academic journal in their entire lives? Yeah. No.
Well, Yeah.
That's just galaxy brain points. I demand you give academic from peer reviewed evidence is their favorite plaint.
Yeah, and I mean, it also depends on what you're discussing. Like somebody called me arrogant because on a tweet, I think I used the word herein. Called me arrogant. It's like, dude, you can't read into my personality because of that. I mean, I'm an author. That's just the words I think of,
Yeah.
So I don't care if it's a tweet or an essay. I'm going to use the words that just come to mind.
Yeah. Theretofore, yes.
Yeah.
So let's get back to you. So you've seen, because I'm kind of like you. I've been witnessing internet atheism for like 25 years. But you really saw the whole arc of it, really.
Right. So that's actually why I got involved online in the first place. And it started up with a blog and ended up with a website. It was because I thought, man, these atheists are getting away with so many fallacious statements, theologically fallacious, historically fallacious, logically fallacious. And that's kind of what got me started. And so, yeah, I was there. And then eventually the new atheism came around that I think was wildly successful in doing one thing, if nothing else. They definitely encouraged the new atheists to just be childish bullies. It's like, you don't need to know anything. You just need to be a jerk and run away instead of dealing with issues. And that's what made him really successful, is anybody can be a jerk. Anybody can call you a bunch of names and be childish and a bully and then run away instead of actually trying to dig into difficult topics. So that was a great move on their part, that's for sure. But of course, they've gone away. And by the way, let me just jump ahead of this. So I recently posted an article titled "The Future of Atheism, Internal Critiques and Nuance." And what I'm predicting for the future of atheism is what I call Christian atheism. And we've already seen that sort of thing for many years. For example, Richard Dawkins calling himself a cultural Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and atheist churches by any other name like humanist or whatever. And it seems to me that atheists are starting to, at some level, recognizing that their worldview is such a dismal failure that, as they always do, they beg, borrow, and steal from the Christian worldview. Yes. And so they're going to keep attempting to make their dogmatheistic, little term I made up, dogma and atheism, dogmatheistic missionary work, but they're going to attempt to also more so than not appeal to the biblical worldview, just as I'll give you an example of that. So I debated an atheist named Skylar Fiction. And I say debated because you could also call it the night of 1001 interruptions. But now, one of his most recent debates, it was about atrocities in the Bible. Okay, and as an atheist and as an admitted moral relativist, he's got nothing, period, full stop, right? So he begins by saying, for tonight, I'm going to grant objective morality. So in other words, he is beginning by completely abandoning his view.
Yeah.
Taking on the theists, the Christian worldview, and then debating on that premise, right? Now, there is a certain amount of internal critique, or, when you say, well, if I grant you that momentarily, then, and you can make certain points. But to begin a debate by totally abandoning your view and never picking it up again. And unfortunately, his opponents didn't say, no, there's no way we're going to allow you to do that. They're like, oh, okay, that's great. And there you go. Now the whole night, you're having this guy make illegitimate arguments, but you already accepted his premise, which isn't even his premise.
Yes.
So that's something to watch out for, because when you push atheists, again, to sleep on the bed they made, they do not want to do that. And so they're trying to find any which way possible to keep on arguing for something that they somehow seem to recognize at some level is just an absolute failure. I mean, atheism fails before it even begins. And so that's kind of what I'm seeing happening nowadays.
Yeah, I couldn't help but notice. I think it was your Facebook page was called "Atheism is Dead." Or are you affiliated?
Yeah, Twitter.
Oh, okay. Your Twitter. Are you affiliated with the other social media accounts of the same name?
No.
Okay. Yeah, well, speaking of what you were saying before about they're going to try to do sort of a cultural Christian spin on atheism. There are it could be sort of a mixed bag, because like Dawkins said that Christianity is a bulwark against radical Islam, because obviously he realizes, as I know other intellectuals have said, the future of Europe is either Christian or Islam. There's no secular Europe in the future, because it's just not stable ground. So Dawkins thinks that Christianity is useful to be a bulwark against Islam. Now, among these sort of Guardianista set, you'll hear critiques of the new atheists say, well, the new atheists are old hat. We have the new atheists, like, Alain de Botton or whatever his name is. But those guys aren't any better, because they just assume atheism is true. And I'd say, oh, well, Dawkins and Harris aren't woke enough for us. They have problematic tweets. Well, that's not the nut of the issue. And there's also a lot of condescension in it. It's like, let these people have their delusions. It's useful for society. No, I'm not going to be condescended to like that, So yeah, it's a mixed bag. So I don't see the third wayers necessarily being any better than the sort of bellicose new atheists.
So I'll tell you what, let's back up then, and let's talk about the definition of atheism. Then the title of this video, is it a worldview? And then we can take it from there. So the thing is, it's incredible how many discussions I've had to have just about the definition of the word atheism, okay? And like with any word in any language, it changes over time. It has different definitions and different usages. So let's say 2 millennia ago, could I have called myself a Christian atheist? Yeah, that would have made sense, because 2 millennia ago, Christians were called atheists, because that would mean they didn't worship the Roman gods or the Greek gods. But like today, would that make sense? No, not logically, because now atheism means something completely different. And now, if you go back to the time of the late 1800s, there's a reason why Thomas Huxley coined the term agnostic.
Agnostic, yeah.
It's because he said, on the one hand, we have theists positively affirming God's existence, meaning they're saying we know that God exists. And we have, on the other hand, atheists positively affirming God's non-existence, meaning atheists were known to claim that they knew that God didn't exist. But Huxley was like, well, I don't have enough evidence to go in either direction. So he wanted a middle position. And so a lot of atheists are actually agnostics, but I guess the term atheist just has so much more cachet, right? And so what happened is that atheists kept on positively affirming God's non-existence. Many of them still do. I have a whole article on my website that's just examples of atheists doing that. But then they kept being asked for evidence, and they couldn't come up with any. So they mostly, on the popular level, have opted for this watered down fallback position. That's something to the likes of, well, it's just lacking a belief in God.
Which is such a weasel, which is such a weaselly way of skirting the burden of proving their claims. And they do make affirmative claims. They wouldn't be comparing God to Santa Claus if they were not positively affirming God's non-existence.
Right. So, but see, the payoff is that then they feel that they are able to just sit back
Mhm.
They don't have to do anything, nothing positive, right? This is strictly a negative, meaning that they're lacking. So that's a negative position. And so then they'll do things like tell you, well, okay, show me any evidence for God's existence. And then they just subjectively wipe it off. No, that doesn't count. No, not good enough. No, 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 no. And that's it. It's a purely subjective exercise where they have nothing to do but just tell you how dumb you are and that nothing counts and it's not good enough and that's not evidence and this, and that's it. So, I mean, that's what's appealing to it. It's very easy. Anybody can just wave their hand.
Well, I actually have a series of videos. Well, it's a three-parter, although the third part is quite silly. But it actually outlines a Socratic dialogue for dealing with the please present me your evidence for God. And what they expect is the fallback is unless I am convinced of your evidence for God, such evidence does not exist. Well, no, I'm not going to agree to that premise because I don't think you're infallible, you're omniscient in knowledge and infallible in judgment. So I'm not going to accept the premise that unless the atheist is convinced there's evidence for God, there is no evidence for God. So yeah, you can ask me for it and I'll happily present it, but just because you're willing to wipe it away, I always say swat it away like a gay French king. It's like, I don't like this evidence, get it away from me. That doesn't prove anything. You could dismiss the idea of God because you don't believe in anything that starts with the letter G. I mean,
Now, if you go back to people like Bertrand Russell and then Richard Dawkins, because he just parroted Russell, he would say things like, there's not enough evidence, which is an admission that there is some, but just subjectively not enough for him.
Yes. And so that can form the basis of a discussion. It's like, well, we can have this discussion then.
So now, in terms of whether atheism is a worldview, okay, it's very simple for the atheist to say, well, no, because it's just one view on one issue, whether God exists, and it's that I lack that belief because of whatever reasons, such as there's not enough evidence or there's not any evidence. But see, a worldview,
that's a claim, by the way. That's an affirmative claim that there is no evidence. So
we'll get to that. Yeah, we're definitely going to get to that. That's a very important issue. So the atheist will say, well, atheism is just that one thing, so it doesn't have this slew of views on various things. It's like, okay, but a worldview is really more like a core. It's like this central thing that then informs you as to how to view everything else. And then you start attaching those other things to that core worldview. So what happens with atheism is you have this view that either God doesn't exist or you just lack a belief in God, depending on what denomination of atheism you adhere to. But the thing is that that atheism then, that core, then infects everything it touches, right? Because I'll sometimes say to atheists, okay, if it's just one view on one issue, then in your thinking about anything and everything, in what area of your thinking of anything and everything whatsoever, do you actually accept the existence of a real God? And their answer, of course, is in none of it, because I'm an atheist, right? It's like, well, but I'm asking you about anything, aesthetics, cosmogony, chinchillas, cucumbers, anything at all. In what area of your thinking? None of it. Well, then that proves atheism has become your worldview because you're using it to analyze every single thing you ever think about. Well, then that's a worldview. That's it right there.
Yes. Oh, they'll say, well, you could admire the beauty of nature. They'll say, well, that's an evolutionary response. So, yada yada yada. Well, already you're compelled to formulate certain explanations for things.
That's part of why atheism is thought restricting. If you're serious about holding on to it, it will not allow you to think about certain things in certain ways or follow the evidence where it leads. It won't allow for that if you're that serious about it, right?
Which makes the self sobriquet of freethinker very ironic, because they're free to think anything as long as they do not arrive at this specific conclusion.
And that's why I call my website True Freethinker. Yes. Right. And so generally the kind of atheism you run into essentially anywhere is basically an anti-Christian support group. That's like the main thing about it that anybody can notice anytime they ever encounter it anywhere. Right. But then
I call it a self-esteem cult because they're all there to gas each other up. Yeah. Continue.
Yeah. Well, one of Ammi's laws is that atheists will begin with conclusions 100% of the time. Okay, so for instance, and the thing we've been discussing, evidence of God's existence. Now, to me, evidence of God's existence, or just the discussion of God's existence when dealing with atheism, that's way down the line. That's like secondary at best. That's like way down the line, because you have much more fundamental issues to deal with up front, right? So, for instance, the issue of evidence. When an atheist asks me for evidence, I don't play the game where they say jump and I say how high. Yeah. When they say jump, I ask them why. And that pretty much destroys the whole discussion. So show me evidence for God. Well, no, wait a minute. That's beginning with a conclusion. First, you need to justify your demand for evidence. Why demand evidence? Why is it incumbent upon me to provide evidence to you? And really, what it will boil down to is if their view is, and the thousands of atheists I've had the discussion with just so happen to believe in something like the universe and everything in it, including our brains, are the product of accidents, right? And now, for some odd reason, atheists really don't like the word accident, and I could care less. Let them choose whatever word will be like a psychological Band-Aid for believing what they do. Call it random, call it unguided, unplanned, uncreated, undesigned. Say whatever you want that'll make you feel better. That is still the bottom line, because when you don't believe the universe and everything it contains was designed, was created, then it just happens to have happened, and that's an accident, right? Call it whatever you want. But the point is, once you make that bed, right, the universe is the way it is by accident. Life came about by accident. Brains came about by accident. Thoughts came about by accident. Then it destroys any premise for truth, logic, or ethics, or maybe at a more refined level, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, right? So that on the atheist view, there's no universal imperative to even be logical, to adhere to. So, for instance, if they tell me, well, your biblical view is not true, well, but that presupposes, right? They're beginning with a conclusion again. They're presupposing that adhering to truth is a universal imperative, which it isn't. And on their view, truth is accidental, right? Because it wasn't designed, it wasn't created. It just happens to have happened that way. And there's nothing within an atheist universe that makes it incumbent upon me to adhere to that truth. There's nothing. I mean, I may choose to, and it may benefit me greatly if I do so, obviously, but it destroys all epistemology. It destroys all imperatives. There's just nothing but my emotively subjective personal preference du jour. Like, hey, today I want to believe in true things that I can verify. Yeah, but that's just a choice. You don't have to, right?
Which is somehow determined by the machinations of the universe. So you can't even claim any virtues. And I always say it's like two pots of stew that are boiling. It's like, would you say that one pot of stew is boiling more rationally than the other? No, they're just processes. Like presuppositionalism is kind of a dirty word, which I don't agree with that it should be a dirty word. It's actually an idea that goes back to Blaise Pascal and probably before, that to use an argument that uses reason, there has to be a sort of prior faith in the utility of reason. Reason doesn't justify itself, And
in
so
fact, I always say reasoning to reason is unreasonable circular reasoning.
Yeah. It sounds good. It sounds impressive when you're saying it on the internet, but you're basically begging the question with a lot of it. When you gave me the sort of topic, you gave me the topic for this. I'm sorry, I lost the public comments here. That's why I was futzing with it. But yeah, so you gave me the comment: is atheism a worldview? And I liked it, and then I didn't like it, and then I liked it again, because I realized you're anticipating a response. You're counting on a certain response from atheists, and in fact, we got it. I don't know what happened to the comment, but some guy said, "Well, it's like saying the existence of giant space. You're not believing in giant space lobsters is a worldview," and I think you're counting on that.
So a couple of things. One is atheism a worldview, as in one? And maybe you could say no, because different atheists will take different views on different issues. Although, like I said, on certain issues, they somehow end up all believing the same basic thing. But maybe we can say, look, the individual atheist does have atheism as the worldview, because again, it's what's informing that atheist about how to think about everything, right? So for instance, kind of a famous example is, Shakespeare said a rose by any other name will smell as sweet. But the thing is, when an atheist looks at a rose, they're looking at a result of an accident that resulted from an accident and a bunch of happy accidents all the way back, where we are looking at kind of a devolved creation of God. And I have to say that due to the effects of the fall, and that the rose will have thorns, right? So we're kind of seeing something that faintly reflects God's creation. But just on a general terms, we would say, well, that's a creation of God, where they would say, no, that's just an accidental thing, right? So therefore, again, that they're looking at it that way because their core worldview is telling them you must think of that rose as the result of a long series of happy accidents. You have to. Right?
Well, yeah, there's also, seen from the sort of lens of classical theism, you could say that atheism is not, like I said, with the giant space lobsters or those stupid analogies, it's not a claim about an additional thing in the world. It's a claim about how everything exists. And with atheism, you end up with a brute fact. You say, there comes a point where you say, just cause. You throw up your arms and you say, just cause. And so that sort of permits a lot in your entire understanding of the world. In fact, it could very well just stop all scientific investigation. You could say, look at any natural phenomenon, say, why does this natural phenomenon happen? You could throw up your shoulders and say, just cause, if that's permissible as an explanation.
And see, ultimately,
he's battling atheists as we're conducting this live stream. Yes.
Ultimately, I mean, the whole scheme, the reason I say atheism fails before it even begins is because it has no foundation whatsoever besides personal preferences, but they themselves are based on hidden assumptions. And I often try to, I beg atheists to reveal those hidden assumptions, and they really don't want to. So what I was actually looking up is a statement by Matt Dillahunty, right? Who says, I want to believe as many true things as possible and as few false things as possible. Okay, he came up with that statement and liked it so much he had it put on a t-shirt, right? But if you notice something, he's revealing something here. He says, I want to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that reveals his pure subjectivism. He's wanting to know as many true things and as few false things just because that's a preference of his, not because there's any universal imperative to adhere to absolute truth. No. He's just saying that he wants to, just like he might want vanilla ice cream and not chocolate ice cream.
Yes.
It's on the same level, right? And so if we were to ask, well, why is it that you want to do that? Then he might come up with anything as a reply. But the point is, his desire for true things and not false things is purely arbitrary. It is absolutely subjective. So that's the sort of thing that makes you realize what's behind what this guy's saying. Well, right there, he's telling you he just wants to. Okay, you want to. But if I don't want to, what if I don't want to? What if I do want to believe false things and not believe in true things? Because after all, remember that truth is accidental on your view, as is my ability to discern it. There is no universal imperative to do so, nor to demand that other people do so either. So that collapses everything right then and there. Because if I say, well, Matt, that's what you want to do, well, but I want to do something different, then ultimately he will have to admit that what he's dealing with in me would be a temporarily and accidentally existing ape is interpreting accidental biochemical neural reactions. Somehow I'm able to interpret them to the effect that I have a personal preference to live a life of delusion, and it ultimately matters not, because that's just another valid option, right? There's no universal imperative for me to adhere to truth. And so that's why even back in the day, people like Sigmund Freud would claim that theism is a Darwinian survival mechanism. It's like, okay, let's like we talked about before, let's grant that for a second. Okay, let's grant that. The universe is accidental. There's no God. So it's an atheist universe, and theism is a Darwinian survival mechanism. Well, then, by golly, it's the most successful Darwinian survival mechanism ever, because most human beings have been theists. And then who are you, atheist, to purposefully seek to damage my ability to survive and to tell me that I'm wrong? Because of what? Because your personal preference is different, even though, according to you, our views are based on accidental biochemical neural reactions. So how am I supposed to, I'm going to change them to agree with the atheist? How?
Well, accidental, biological adaptations to optimize our ability to reproduce. So obviously there's some reproductive success in believing that the universe was created by a loving God rather than, life has no purpose and we should all just go Jonestown,
Or that, okay, you just took my brain to the various times we've seen, particularly women who attend these atheist meetings, like the Skepticon job, and then they complain about being sexually harassed. Skepticon job, yeah. Then they complain about having been harassed by atheist men. And it's like, you're hanging out with guys who actually claim to believe that there's no absolute ethics and that their only actual objective purpose in life is to reproduce.
Yes.
What do you expect from guys like that, right? It's terrible. I mean, it's horrendous, but just think about the kind of people you're dealing with. That's the mentality they're bringing into their interaction with the opposite sex.
I really regretted reading the BuzzFeed expose of Lawrence Krauss. I now have the mental image of Lawrence Krauss in the hot tub just seared into my brain. I can't lose it.
You can't unsee that.
Yes.
That'll go on my list of things I could have died without knowing.
I was going to say something. Hey, Mr. 79 Man.
Hey.
Yeah. Oh, what you were going to say? Okay. So it's my preference to behave irrationally. That actually reminds me of Dostoevsky's Underground Man in Notes from the Underground. He wrote that in the full flower of scientific materialism in the 1860s, and he said, okay, well, I accept the premises of these new thinkers. There was all very all courant at the time, and so I grant your premises. I'm going to purposefully live then irrationally. I'm going to purposely live immorally and immorally in a self-sabotaging manner, just to prove that I'm not your wind-up doll. Basically, if I'm programmed, I'm going to act out just to prove I'm not acting in defiance of these biological compulsions. But yeah, it's very interesting how we kind of land back in the same place with these same issues that have essentially not changed in 150 years.
Yeah, and then it all goes back to, again, the atheist beginning with a conclusion, such as asserting that it's a universal imperative to adhere to truth or to facts or to reality, which again, on their worldview, are all accidental, because the universe could have been much, much different. It happens to be this way accidentally. It wasn't designed, it wasn't created. So then that also leads to another issue, which is when we talk about the laws of logic, usually when we discuss these issues, we're talking on two levels, ontologically and epistemology, right? Epistemic. So on the epistemological view or level, the laws of logic are these things that we have listed, right? We have described, and then we come up with these and we call them laws. But what is it that we're describing? Well, we're describing reality, right? So then we're talking about the ontological level, which is the universe is the way it is, and then we observe how it functions, and then we come up with these laws to make sense of it and to make sense of our own statements and views, right? But because on the atheist view, that universe, that reality, that truth, that fact is accidental, then there's no universal imperative to adhere to logic either. Because, yeah, you could say, well, but the universe is this way. Yeah, but it is. That doesn't mean I ought to adhere to it. So I can be totally illogical. There's nothing holding my feet to that fire. And again, let me just take a sidestep to something I know they might say things like, well, but if you live your life trying to be illogical, it'll create a lot of problems for you. Well, of course it will. That's not quite the issue we're going to yet. We're just at the fundamental level of that. That is more like pragmatic. Like you should do it because things will turn out better for you. That's one issue. But the point is, the bed that they're making is that the universe, truth, facts, reality are accidental. And so when we use the laws of logic to describe them and to adhere to them, then on atheism, that is not an imperative. That's just another I want to, right? It's just another another personal preference. That's all it is. And so when atheist tells me, well, you're being illogical, I don't immediately get into the discussion of how, well, I'm really not. First, I'll ask them, so what? Who cares, right? I mean, that's the fundamental level. So, for example, the Bible's full of contradictions. Now, I could go, oh, yeah, show me one, and then we can talk about it. Well, there's a place for that, but it's way down the line in my thinking. What I'm going to say first is, okay, by what premise of your worldview do you condemn something being contradictory or illogical? That's the first thing to discuss. And frankly, I never seem to get beyond that fundamental level because there is no resolution for them except to jump to emotive objectivism, which is, well, I want things to be logical. I mean, that's really the only option they have. So we never get to the discussion of the particular alleged Bible contradiction, because we never get past the point of them actually having a premise upon which to condemn illogical things such as contradictions. They can't.
By which standard? By which standard? Well, that's why I think it's useful to have like sort of a schema for sort of Socratic dialogues where you zero in on those premises. Like if someone says the Bible is full of contradictions, I'll tell you exactly how it's going to happen. You say, okay, well, please give me one example. I say, okay, well, here's an example, yada, yada, yada. And you say, well, I take issue with this and this and this. You're going to come to an impasse because they're not going to admit their own, then they're going to jump to something else. And the fallback assumption is the Bible is full of contradictions until I am convinced otherwise. That's why starting with those premises is always going to be a pain in the ass. I'm sorry, I shouldn't talk like that. It's like there is no evidence for God. If you present a piece of evidence for God, you know how it's going to play out. It's going to be a chicken walk. You'll be jumping from one thing to another, and you're never going to be well until the atheist is convinced that there is evidence for God. They'll fall back to their assumption that there isn't. But that's not going to happen. You'll reach one dead end, and then they'll jump to something else.
In fact, my experience, relive that experience. So mine is, the Bible's full of contradictions. Okay, show me one. Well, here's a website that lists hundreds of them. Okay, so what if I resolve every single one of those, right? Because, okay, you obviously can't do that. There are people who have resolved hundreds of them. I mean, in my book, Pop Atheist Bible Expositors, I do a lot of resolution of supposed contradictions. And it only ends up discrediting the atheist, by the way. But the issue is if you say, okay, let's actually take one. And the thing is, it's Twitter sized to say there's a contradiction in this verse. And then I might have to write who knows how much, a paragraph, a page, two, who knows how many. Mm-hmm. And then they go, you're just rationalizing.
You were committing the logical was it special pleading or something like that? So, yeah.
But see again, okay, and let's go with that.
Get your logical fallacy.
Because remember, my main thing is if you're telling me to jump, I'm going to ask you why. Yes. I'm not going to say how high. I'm going to ask you why, right? So if you say, well, it's a fallacy, you're rationalizing this and that, again, the issue always needs to go back to, so what? There's no universal imperative to adhere to logic on your worldview. On your worldview, there's logic is accidental, as is my ability to discern it. There's no universal imperative to do so, nor to demand that other people do so. That's all gone. And that's why they don't want to sleep in the bed they made, because that's all gone and they can't proceed with their atheist missionary endeavors.
I just to, in my opinion, saying, instead of like sort of throwing red meat to them like that, I'd say, yes, this is a discussion I would be willing to have. However, you are operating from assumptions that I will not assent to. And so, yeah, put disposing of those assumptions as sort of a precondition for having the argument about something that would actually materially affect, there being evidence for God. Yes.
In fact, let's go there. So, for instance, show me evidence for God. Okay. I'm not going to start listing stuff that I consider evidence so you can just swoop it away. And by the way, let me just take a side note here, because unfortunately, Carl Sagan made a little dictum very popular, which is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is incoherent, really, because extraordinary claims, first of all, there's no standard of extraordinariness. Okay, let's just start there. So it's purely subjective right there, and it falls apart instantly. There's no measurement of extraordinariness. But okay, let's say God's existence would be an extraordinary claim, but then it's really a case of, when it comes down to it, extraordinary claims would just require adequate evidence. That's all there is to it. But that would be on my worldview, where truth and reality and facts and evidence are real things that are universally incumbent upon me to adhere to, not on their worldview. And so it would be something like this. Show me evidence for God's existence. And then I would say, well, at first you need to justify your demand for evidence, which they can't do. They can just tell you that, oh, pretty please. I mean, I had somebody do this in a Twitter discussion. I kept making that point. First, you need to justify your demand for evidence. And just in case, let me explain a little more about what I mean. So I come up to you on the street and I go, give me your wallet. And you're like, no, why should I? You have no premise for asking me to do that. So then I pull out a 12-gauge shotgun. Okay, well, there you go. That's a premise. That is a solid premise right there. But unless you have that, who are you?
Yeah.
Who are you to ask me to do that, right? And it's not just a personal thing like, well, who are you to ask me to do that? It's just that you have no valid premise upon which to do that because of your worldview, which provides you no premise for it. It's just another I want to, right? It's another preference. I would like to see evidence. And then, well, why? Well, because we should only believe in things for which we have evidence. But then that's another assertion as well, right? You see, basically, what atheists are doing is they're piling up assertions on top of assertions on top of assertions until it's all assertions all the way down, right? It's the abyss. It's a bottomless pit of assertions.
Yeah, I also like putting the pragmatics of it front and center. The burden of proof is not some abstract law of truth or some acid test of truth. It's a pragmatic principle. It's unless I am confronted with a reason to believe X, Y, and Z, I will happily go on continuing to believe what I believe. So so I'm saying, okay, so you're saying that there is no evidence for God. I don't believe that. I think there is evidence for God. I'm perfectly justified in asking you, what is your basis for saying there is no evidence for God? Because unless I am confronted with some sort of argument to lead me to the conclusion that there is no evidence for God, I will happily continue going on believing that there is, very sound and valid evidence for God.
But see, then again, so if they were to say, well, the burden of proof is on the person making the positive claim. Okay, on the atheist view, what I just heard is,
yeah,
right? Because I'm listening to somebody who claims that they're an accidentally and temporarily existing ape, just saying that, making that claim. And now, again, and I always like to do this, yes, relying on the burden of proof for positive affirmations, that would work well. But the point is there is no universal imperative to adhere to the burden of proof. There's nothing there. They have nothing, literally nothing to stand on. So, when you're refusing to meet the burden of proof, at least at the outset of a conversation, you'll take a lot of heaped abuse upon you, but keep pressing the point that is still not a universal imperative because you don't have any. So now if you're saying, well, pretty please just do me a personal favor and meet the burden of proof, then that might be a discussion if I'm in a good mood. But the point is, if an atheist wants to make a bed, you need to demand that they sleep in it. And when it comes to something like the burden of proof, really what they're telling me is, well, look, some very educated, accidentally and temporarily existing apes from atop their imitation ivory tower told us that we have a burden of proof if we're making positive claims. And I'm just going to say, I'm not impressed. I've been at the zoo many times. I enjoy the antics of the apes, but I'm just not that impressed by their And so ultimately, I'm going to take the atheists so seriously that I'm going to continuously apply what they're telling me to themselves. You see what I mean? So I'm not just going to I'm not letting anything get by me without saying, well, wait a minute. But on your view, this is the issue. This is the case. There are no universal imperatives. So that absolutely destroys anything you might have to say at that point. And this is why, by the way, the question, why is there something rather than nothing? That has traditionally been considered the premier philosophical question.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for it. Because if you reply to why is there something rather than nothing by saying accident, right? Uncaused, unguided, uncreated, undesigned, then from that follows that that's it. You're done for.
Yeah.
All you have thereafter are emotive, subjective, personal preferences du jour, and yet even those will be based on hidden assumptions. And when you reveal those hidden assumptions, you'll inevitably find out that they're begging, borrowing, and stealing from the Judeo-Christian worldview. It's inevitable.
Well, my approach is different, and it grants instead of arguing about philosophy or arguing about metaphysics, which is pretty much always a lost cause when you're dealing with atheists. But yeah, okay, I'll agree. Okay, we're dealing is strictly with subjective ones. Okay, do you want me to believe X, Y, and Z? Do you want me to believe there is no evidence for God? If you do desire for me to believe that, please give me a reason to believe that. Elsewise, I will happily go on believing. So I grant, I don't talk, I try to avoid talking philosophy. I put it simply, do you want me to believe this? If so, give me a reason to believe it. If not, I will happily skip on my way, but they don't want that. that gets down to their desire to change your mind. So yeah.
Yeah, and okay, let's say we go there, because sometimes we do get to the point where we're talking about evidence, but even then I'll stop and I'll say, well, but what would count as evidence for God's existence? And that becomes purely subjective as well, because now they're giving me, well, I personally think that thus and such would count. So even at that level, it's absolutely arbitrary. So what would that evidence look like? What would count as that sort of evidence? And then you can kind of deal with whatever they may happen to bring up, beginning by just pointing out that it's purely arbitrary.
They're going to say any evidence. I know. I've been through that too many times. Yeah.
Or that, well, I don't know, but God does, and if he existed, he would reveal it to me, right? That sort of thing.
They would dismiss it as a hallucination if that happened.
But see, even then,
every historical instance, you know.
But even then, to them, that's a logical point, and you have no premise for logic.
Yeah.
But you will find, incidentally, that all atheists do have something in common. They're theologians. I mean, horrendously bad ones, but they are theologians, because that is the theology. If God did exist, then he would reveal to me evidence that is undeniable. That's theological, right?
Uh-huh.
And incidentally, I find a few things. So one of my specified bits of research was I read the stories of just over 100 atheists and why they converted to atheism. And there's definitely patterns, no question about it. One thing I noticed is they love to boast about just how young they were when they converted to atheism. If it's in the single digits, all the better, right? But they'll say single digits, or maybe by the time they were a teenager. Most of them will do that. And then so there's a few things you can discern from this. One is, especially if you were in the single digits, I know that there's savants out there, but they're very rare. And so what you're really telling me is that it had nothing to do with logic or philosophy or science or evidence of it or anything. And then the atheist gets stuck in that literally childish theology. And that's why you hear him say really embarrassing childish things, such as likening God to a sky daddy and Santa Claus and invisible friends, because that's where their theology got retarded. I mean, literally retarded, meaning stopped growing, stopped developing, is at that childhood level where that's all they got is this incredibly childish way of looking at things, and they never grew out of that. And then when they're in the teenage years, now I am empathetic to a lot of the stories I read, because their experience is very different than mine. I came to believe in Jesus when I was 30. So that was plenty of time in my life to pour over some really difficult issues and have life experiences. But when you're in your single digits, much less your teenage years, you're most likely just rebelling against mommy and daddy. And you're trying to get away from mommy's apron strings. And some of them do tell really disappointing stories about being mistreated by believers or having their priests. Catholicism has a lot to do with atheism. Having their priests say, yeah, don't ask us those kind of questions. Really just horrible, horrible stuff. My heart breaks for stuff like that, you know. But when they boast about just how early they became atheists, you know, it's not anything intellectual. It was just like an emotional thing and rebellion, really.
Yeah, there's some kid, I always forget his name. He got famous for being a conservative, a teenage conservative on YouTube, and then he came out as an atheist, and he, you know, angered a lot of his fan base from before. I forget his name, but he has such an embarrassing, you know, invisible sky daddy sort of atheism. And he said that when he was 13 or whatever, he asked his pastor a question. And a theological question, like why is there so much suffering in the world? Something like that, probably, which is valid. And his pastor told him what he reported to be word salad. So I'm not there. I don't know what the pastor said, but maybe it was word salad. Maybe it was something a little bit beyond your level of understanding, in which case it might have been helpful to ask a follow-up question. But no, he just what his pastor said was word salad, and therefore he just decided, you know, therefore no God.
And there are, I mean, okay, so I'm being fair that a lot of them endured ridiculous oppression and responses or non-responses, and I'm empathetic to that. But some is just pretty shocking, like, you know, the comedian Ricky Gervais. He said when he was like 8, he asked his mom a question, a theological type question, and she really couldn't answer it. So by golly, he became an atheist. It's like, okay, because your mom didn't know the answer to a question you had.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of their reasons are emotive. I mean, I can empathize with them, but then they're also just absolutely illogical. And even if you grew up where you're told not to ask questions, it's still illogical to say, therefore, I'm throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right?
Yeah.
That's like rejecting the premise because of somebody who holds it, who you don't like, or who you think is misusing it.
Another thing you hear a lot is I prayed for X and God never answered my prayer. Well, you're admitting that you prayed at one point. Doesn't that make you irrational? I thought we were all irrational for praying, but you prayed at one point. So I don't...
But then that's theological. Again, it's atheist theology. In fact, you're reminded. Okay, this is the atheist Louis Walpert. He was having a discussion with Justin Briley from the Unbelievable Show, and Walpert says, "I used to pray, but I gave it up because when I asked God to help me find my cricket bat, he didn't help." And Briley says, "Right. And that was enough for you to prove that God does not exist?" And Walpert says, "Well, yes, I gave it up completely."
I'm almost tempted to think that he was being satirical there or something.
I think you might be giving him too much credit.
Well, Peace here, a great commenter, Peace. He says, in the words of Upton Sinclair, you can't make a man understand something which his paycheck depends on him not understanding. Dawkins could die, go to heaven, and come back alive and wouldn't be able to admit God exists. Yes, Richard Dawkins is a professional atheist. He has no dispassionate interest in the truth. He has his fan base. They're going to buy his books. They're going to pay for his tiered Magic of Reality membership club. Do you know about that?
That doesn't sound familiar.
There's a Richard Dawkins fan club, and you pay annually, and as you pay more annually, you get to a higher tier, and every tier has its own name. And when you pay the highest tier, which is like $100,000 a year, you enter the magic of reality level, which entitles you to 50% off the Richard Dawkins merch. You don't even get that for free for $100,000. You get a coupon for the Richard Dawkins merch. But the real sell here is that you're entitled to a free meal with Richard Dawkins.
Wow, that will definitely make me shed a tear. So he's basically become a guru. Let's just,
Exactly. Well, this is not recent. This has been for a long time. So yeah.
By the way, I found another quote from Walpert. I stopped believing in God when I was 15 or 16 because he didn't give me what I asked for. That's what he's saying, So now, when we talked about the issues of Sky Daddy and Santa Claus and Invisible Friend, all these really childish things. Number one is that those are category errors, okay? Because for one, you can easily prove they're category errors because there's no Dinesh D'Souza is famous for saying this. There's no atheists writing books like The End of Santa Claus, right? Mm-hmm. Santa Claus is not great. The Santa Claus delusion.
I've never met the alcoholic who had their life turned around by Santa Claus. Yeah.
Well, but the point is, so it's a category error because, for one, no atheist is seeking to debunk any of those things. And they might say, well, but we don't have to because we know they're not real. But they're category errors because Santa Claus, Invisible Friends, Sky Daddies, those are not what are known as philosophically necessary being, right? In fact, I personally did write an article disproving the existence of the mystical concept of Santa Claus. And I was mostly saying it's because we've had evidence for generations that parents are the ones doing the things that are attributed to that mystical Santa Claus, right? So the issue is that it's a category error, mostly because they're not necessary beings. Without them, it wouldn't really matter. Whereas without God, we wouldn't be here to discuss it, right? And so if you don't mind, as we talked about lacking premises, let me just dig a little bit into, well, then why is it that we're sitting here saying, hey, we can critique atheism? What about our premises? And so just for a minute or two, if we think about even the first...
By the way, I'm going to get some water. I can hear you, though.
Please do so. So the very first verse in the Bible, typically translated as, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Well, there you have something that we today know about with our latest high tech by the most intelligent people, that our universe is a time-space matter continuum, right? Well, somehow the Bible writers knew that, and it's the very first verse, because in the beginning, that's time. God created the heavens, and that's space, and the earth, and that's matter. So there it is right there, right? In the very first verse of the Bible, you have a basic cosmology. And then in the beginning, God, so God is already there. So meaning he exists outside or beyond or transcends time, space, and matter, although he can interact with it when he wants to, all right? So then you have a basic concept that, think about it again, in the beginning, God created. So a mindful, volitional ability that is indicative of personhood, whereby he would have carried out a plan. So formulated a plan and carried it out, and with the capability of doing so. Mm-hmm. So now you're looking at a God who transcends time, space, and matter, and is a creator. So there you have God being a spirit, timeless or eternal, and without particular restriction to locality. So omnipresent.
Immaterial, yes.
Yeah, and the ability, the personhood ability to formulate a plan, carry it out with the potency to do so, so omnipotent. And there you have a basic theology in one single verse. So basic cosmology, basic theology. And so what we can discern about the universe is that it functions according to linear time with one event following another. And that's what allows for cause and effect, right?
Yes.
Linear time, boy, I tell you, it's just one thing after another. And this is what makes for the ability to build categories, because once you can say this effect was created by this cause, or this cause created this effect, then you have categories. This thing is the cause, this thing is the effect. And then that going through linear time with things progressing is what builds the stuff of the universe, which we then describe as, well, this is logical. These are the categories, and this makes sense and this doesn't. So with the view that the universe was created via design, and so truth, reality, and facts are what they are purposefully, then we have an ability to discern them. And incidentally, this is the premise for the scientific method.
Yes.
It was the biblical theology that a rational creator created a rational creation and populated it with rational beings who could therefore rationally discern it.
Yes.
Right? And so on this view, truth is, and it is absolute, and it was meant to be. Discerning truth is a universal imperative. And this is why we're concerned with reality and facts and evidence and everything else that we could discuss if the atheists were to ever get around to showing even a single premise for it, besides their personal preference based on hidden assumptions that we need to work to reveal, right? So that's kind of like a crash course in our premise for talking about these things the way that we're talking about them, and our ability to do, like somebody in the comments said, atheists use the term logical fallacy like the left uses racism. And I love that because, again, when they tell me I'm being logically fallacious, my first reaction isn't, well, let's talk about how I am or I'm not. Well, that's down the line for me. First, so what? You have no premise upon which to condemn something that is illogical to begin with. So you're already at a loss. You have no premise to make that statement. And so, in fact, that's why people have coined the term the fallacy.
Yes.
Or one I came up recently is the assertion fallacy, because I realized a lot of people tell me, hey, you're being fallacious, but they never bothered telling me even how. They just claim it. So, okay, you're just asserting I'm fallacious without even bothering to elucidate why. So that's the assertion fallacy.
It's funny. It used to be the case. I don't know if it's still the case, but if you would look up Stalin mass murder in Google, the first result will be a Michael Shermer article called the atheist tyrant fallacy. I guess pointing that out, you're guilty of a fallacy is the atheist mass murder fallacy.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to try to look up a certain quote from Shermer that's very telling, because he kind of came to odds with the rest of the, the main four new atheists, right? The four My Little Ponies of atheism.
Well, three, they never filled that fourth seat, but yeah, Lawrence Krauss was talking for it, but yeah.
There were originally four, and it was Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah.
So the four My Little Ponies. So, of course, Christopher Hitchens passed away, and there's a very interesting video by, I'm going to say that his name is I'm looking it up. So anyhow, towards the end of his life, Hitchens was hanging out with a Christian friend of his quite a bit and poring over the gospel. He was really interested in that. It was something like Larry Totten or something like that.
Yeah, I heard about that.
I'm just stating, Larry Touten, Taunton. I have that video on my site, actually. And then Daniel Dennett just went back to his real life, went back to work, to doing his actual job. And then Sam Harris became what I call a pseudo-neuroscientist. And only because he had admitted before becoming a full-fledged neuroscientist that he was bringing certain atheistic presuppositions into what he was doing. So I'm always told, hey, you're supposed to be a totally unbiased scientist. But he was very open about it. So I call him a pseudo-neuroscientist, even though he's a legitimate scientist. But, again, he made that bet. I'm just asking him to sleep in it.
None of them seem to be scientists of particular accomplishment. I mean, Richard Dawkins has not been a research scientist in 45 years. Harris, I don't know if he's I don't think he's a big name in neuroscience. My impression is that he's like trying to put like sort of a new age sort of West Coast spin on new atheism. So he sees his own guru now. He's like, well, it's mystical, it's mindfulness, all these sort of buzzwords, trying to repackage the turd that is new atheism.
Yeah, and anymore, there are academic atheists that kind of exist outside of the public sphere because being scholars in whatever field, scholars in general rarely climb down from their imitation ivory towers. But today, basically the most active and well-known atheists are just guys on YouTube, honestly. Which, we're on YouTube, so it's not like it's not a genetic fallacy. I'm not saying what they say is fallacious because they're formatting. But this era of the new atheists has really only survives in the way I mentioned before, which is atheists thinking that as long as they can make fun of you and run away, that's good enough.
I always thought like Christian apologists sort of overestimated the influence of the Four Horsemen and underestimated the influence of guys like T.J. Kirk. I think that's probably the sort of slime of that, where the what do you call it, the primordial soup of new atheism. And that's a lot of kids saw that. I have no idea what that guy is doing these days. He was a big deal. He was on TV back in the day. He was on CNN and whatnot. But I have no idea what he's doing these days.
Well, so again, the main thing for me is everything the atheist claims is lacking foundation. It's all assertions. But that's why I said atheists begin with conclusions 100% of the time. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit of a lengthy quote you might appreciate from G.K. Chesterton.
Okay.
Because he makes a lot of really great points in here. This is from his book, Orthodoxy. And the chapter is called The Suicide of Thought. Yeah, and he says, but the new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be really be a revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything really gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus, he writes one book complaining that the imperial oppression insults the purity of women, and then writes another book about the sex problem, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, and then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher, that all life is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, and then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, and then denounces aristocrat profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls a flag a bauble, and then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. A man of this school goes first into a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. And then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything.
That is beautiful. That is beautiful. It's actually a critique of nihilism, and even if it's a nihilism that doesn't acknowledge itself, and you see it a lot in the contemporary political theater with people who only know how to destroy. They cannot even assert what it is that they believe in, what they cherish, what they value. All they know how to do is destroy, and there are all sorts of contradictions in their belief.
And see, that's part of the point about the atheist worldview. When it's strictly negative, they don't have a positive position. So it's always attack, 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 right? Yeah. In fact, another statement by Chesterton from his book Heretics: every man in the street must hold to a metaphysical system and hold it firmly. The possibility is that he may have held it so firmly and so long as to have forgotten all about its existence. I apologize to the rationalists for even calling them rationalists. They are no rationalists. We all believe fairy tales and live in them. Some hold to the undemonstrable dogma of the existence of God. Some, the equally undemonstrable dogma of the existence of the man next door. But now for me, all this ties into, now I'm going to read a bit from the Bible, Romans chapter 1, right?
Is that what Mr. 79 man here is Romans?
Okay, excellent.
23.
So I'll just pick some verses from here. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Okay, let me pause there for just a second on that point. Because sometimes I'll ask atheists when they're going on and on about evolution, okay? And let me just say something here. Biology is a science, but evolution is a worldview philosophy that tells you how to interpret biology, right? And so
there's no testable hypothesis of evolution.
Well, evolution is like anything else. Without defining what we're even talking about, there's no discussion to be had, right? So, but one thing I'll ask atheists is, do you troll the internet to argue with people about any other theory? whatsoever about anything ever, any other scientific theory? And no, of course, generally not, because many atheists have taken what is supposed to be a theory about biology and they've turned it into their worldview. We're back to worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So that, well, everything evolved, right? Our thoughts evolved because our brains evolved, because life evolved, because the earth evolved, because stellar evolution, right? Chemical evolution, biological evolution, all of it just sort of happens to have happened. And so that's one thing I'll ask if they ever troll the internet to argue with anybody about any other theory, right? And so what you see here is that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, but became vain in their imagination, right? Professing themselves so wise they became fools. They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like man, birds, four-footed beasts, right? And so this is why I've often pointed out that atheism is pagan, because it is a form of nature worship. Because after all, human beings came to be because the natural world just spit us out, right? I mean, we were, quote unquote, created by nature. and that's why the theory of evolution is such an issue to them. Because when you're discussing when you're disputing evolution with them, it's like they're not listening to you disputing certain aspects of a scientific theory. They're hearing you attacking the very core of their worldview.
Yes.
Right? That's why they get so insane about it. And so this is part of what I'm applying from this chapter, is that they neglected God, and they'll tell you about, oh, wow, nature is so awesome, and there's so much awe and inspiration in nature. Well, sure, but you're looking at it in a sort of a pagan sense. So then continuing on parts of Romans 1 here, part of it is, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanliness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Right? Like we talked about earlier, you're complaining about being sexually harassed by atheists when you're hanging out with people who believe there's no universal imperatives to adhere to absolute ethics, and that their only purpose in life is to reproduce. Yeah. And then they changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the creator, right? Who is blessed forever. Amen. Okay, and so that was just very, very telling. And then you have this stuff about God giving them up to vile affections, and likewise, men leaving the natural use of women burned in their lust for one towards another. And that's something that, especially in our day, has become very, very key. Because, for instance, when I debated Skylar Fiction, that's one of the main points he made in the debate, is that he rejected Christianity, and now he's championing LGBT issues. And it's like, well, of course. I mean, that goes hand in hand. So this is kind of like what you see here. Once you reject God's created order, then you're stuck in you're having to celebrate disorder, because that's all you got left. You have nothing else. Pure chaos.
But they will then reject certain other sexual proclivities, but that's this month at least. Next month.
Of course.
That will be the progressive thing to believe, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I had a big discussion on Twitter with somebody about those issues, and I pushed them on, well, what do you think about, say, incest?
Yeah.
I totally reject it. It's gross. It's disgusting. And I say, but those are just subjective statements that you personally find it gross and disgusting. That's not a standard. And I kind of really cornered them, because they were pushing me on being, the typical stuff, homophobic and anti this and anti that. And I just took it. I'm just taking it, but I'm kind of pushing back to show them in a way we're both exactly the same. But you reject certain sexual practices just like I do. And that, of course, resulted in eventually they did the hide tweet feature. So all those are gone. So
I'm sorry, you sounded a bit Dawkinsian there. I just go one further.
Oh, well, that's an interesting thing too. So as an atheist, okay, as a Christian, you reject 99% gods. I only go one God further. And if you realize why I reject the why I go one further, right? If you really understood why you rejected the 99%, then you'd understand why I go the one further. That kind of an argument. And it's like, well, yeah, as a theist, as a monotheist, a Trinitarian monotheist, I believe in 100% more gods than you. Yeah, I mean, what of it? And then it's not as simple as, well, if you're rejecting 99% of gods, I'm rejecting one more. But wait a minute. By definition, God would be the ultimate being, right? I mean, that's a pretty simple thing. God would be an ultimate being, because if there's a being more ultimate than God, then that being would be God. So by definition, God would be the ultimate being. And by further definition, there can only be one ultimate. So there comes a point where if I say, well, 2 plus 2, we don't know what it equals, because there's literally an infinity of numbers that equal.
Okay, but your answer just so happens to be the correct one. How convenient. Yes, that's the Ricky Gervais approach.
So, I mean, there's so many ways to tackle those kind of issues. My primary point was just that because there's a proposed infinity of answers, that doesn't mean that there's one that isn't correct, just one. Mm-hmm. Right? So when you're saying, you reject 99% gods, why not go one further? It's because there is one.
Yes.
I reject the infinity of numbers to place under 2 plus 2 equals, except for 4, right? Because that is the one truth.
Yeah, well, you could also go, well, there's a category error. The pagan gods were gods that existed within the time-space fold. They existed in pantheons where there are several dozen gods within the same pantheon. So as far as monotheistic gods, there are only like the 4 or so sort of competing. I guess 5. You just say generic deistic god or something. But yeah,
ultimately, it's like what I was talking about based on Genesis 1:1, is that God has to be a personal being,
mm-hmm.
right? Even if you're taking the Romans 1 approach and you're basing it off of your observation of nature, because Christians often speak about natural revelation versus specific or special revelation in scripturated. So from that, you could discern that this is a cause and effect, linear time world or universe, and that there's a rationale behind that, and that allows for rationality and all those things that I already went through. So that if you're proposing an impersonal being as God, that just discredits itself right then and there. And in fact, ultimately, again, this is not where I would start with an atheist. For me, with atheism, this is way, way down the line, as I said before. But to me, it all breaks down to, I'm not really sure how to categorize it. I would say logic and ethics, but in a way, logic has to be applied to ethics. So I'm kind of thinking I have to coin some kind of term that combines them, like whatever that may turn out to be. Because, for example, back to my debate with Skylar Fiction, my opening statement was to say that the best foundation for ethics is, and then I went through the 7 top options humanity has ever proposed. As far as I know, 5 were theological, 2 were naturalistic, and I went down the line debunking them all, including strict monotheism, including pantheism, including polytheism, all of them. And I resulted in that the Trinitarian monotheism is the best one. So even then, there's ways that you can do this where it's not good enough to say, well, they're claiming God, you're claiming God, they're claiming God, it's over there, they're claiming God, it's all the same. No, it's not even close. just because you're throwing the term God around, right?
Yeah.
And so it all comes down to logic and ethics, some kind of mashed combination of the two. For example, that's the problem Schuyler was having, is he claims that he's rejecting the God of the Bible because the God of the Bible commits unethical actions, but then he has been forced to admit time and time and time again that he cannot actually absolutely condemn any actions because he's a moral relativist. So therefore, he has debunked his very own excuses for rejecting God.
Mm-hmm.
That's it for him. It's over. It's just that he has, a gang of fanboy yes men who basically repeat anything he says. But when you're thinking about it logically, he has actually debunked himself, which is why he was at least wise enough to begin that debate I mentioned.
Granting the premise.
Granting something that absolutely contradicts his worldview and abandoning his own worldview just to have a discussion. Again, that's the bet he made. He should be made to sleep in it.
Yes.
He just doesn't want to. He says, I'm going to borrow your bed.
Having the cake and eating it too. Yeah, that's exactly
as not wanting to get fat.
Yeah. Exactly as G.K. Chesterton wrote 100 years prior.
Yeah.
He nailed it perfectly.
Yeah.
I also like, you talked about heretics. You probably know this. G.K. Chesterton has a great comment about how the heretics of every age venerate the heretics that came before them, even though their heresy completely contradicted the modern heresies. Like, for contemporary atheists, Giordano Bruno was some great martyr. But Giordano Bruno wasn't a scientific materialist. He was as further off in his beliefs than Christians are. So it's all very ironic,
Gosh, I had a train leaving the train of thought left the station. It had to do with venerating the previous heretics. I could have sworn I had a really good thought about that, but the train left. Maybe it'll come back.
About Darwin or something, or
no, just about the current heretics venerating the previous ones. Oh yeah, it was just that the train just came back into the station. It was just an interesting statement that Chesterton made. He's endless witticisms. One thing he said is, why do we call theologians that deny miracles liberal? Why do we call them liberal? Because liberal would be I'm of offering and accepting the liberty to believe in miracles, right? That's not liberal, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like some of the wordplay that's going on today when we're told, well, being a liberal means that you're a dogmatically authoritarian militant.
Yeah.
What? But that's also the issue with a lot of people who are actually leftists calling themselves liberal. And unfortunately, they're giving true liberals a bad name.
Mm-hmm. I really liked it when about 2 years ago, when sort of Kanye West came out with his beliefs. He was calling himself a free thinker. I'm like, yes, I think finally that term has been reclaimed. No one was talking about atheism. In fact, he's shown he's very much not an atheist, but he was talking about free thinker, and no one really debated it. It was like, okay, I'm a free thinker. I can arrive at my own conclusions, which is what being a free thinker is supposed to be. So I thought that was terrific, that it appears all the secular, atheist, materialist connotations had finally been washed out of that term.
Well, another example is I call myself a skeptic, but a true and honest skeptic, where a lot of people that call themselves skeptics are really cynics. And that's different. So the skeptic would say, well, I won't believe until where a cynic will say, I won't believe, period.
Yes.
Right?
Radical skepticism just ends up consuming itself. Yeah.
And it's the same actually in agnosticism, right? So an agnostic would say, I don't believe in God because whatever. Let's say there's not enough evidence. Where a militant agnostic will say, I don't have evidence, you don't either, neither does anybody, nor will we ever. Right? That's totally a dogmatic position.
Yes.
And then, like I said earlier, that crosses over into atheism, because when atheists take that watered down fallback position of, I just lack a belief in God because I don't really know, well, that's right hand in hand with agnosticism. It's really the same thing at that level.
Well, yeah, and then it gets to the thing. Well, if I don't. This is the thing: is that the save is supposed to let them sort of weasel out of bearing the burden of proof. But I don't believe in God because there is no evidence. But they don't have to defend. I lack a belief in God because there is no evidence for God. So they're trying to get out of defending the premise there is no God, which should be provable in principle. You can prove things don't exist. That's very provable. Now they have a different kind of claim. There is no evidence for X. I don't think you can even prove that in principle. So not only do they not escaped the burden of proof, they now have a far more severe burden of proof. Look, in every criminal case, okay, either the man is guilty or he's not. Either he murdered his wife or he didn't. Both sides present evidence for their cases. So what is this claim for which no possible evidence can be presented? I'm not sure that's provable at all.
Well, right, because positively affirming that there is no evidence for God's existence is really a claim to omniscience.
Yes.
And that's an attribute of God. So you'd be proving that God exists in a manner of speaking, right? And then something that is sort of attached to that is the concept that they'll say, well, you can't prove a negative, which you just touched upon, really, right? And we can prove negatives, of course. I mean, I can prove to you that there's not a foot at the end of my arm. There you go. But incidentally, the claim you can't prove a negative is claiming to have proved the negative, namely that you can't prove a negative. They're claiming, if you do in fact have evidence-based beliefs, yes.
Thank you for pointing that out. Again, I like to be a little confrontational, so I'll say things like, "What if you woke up and saw the plastered as the headline of your local paper, Joe Smith doesn't pay his taxes." So no, I wouldn't like. Well, it's a negative claim. It's like, well, no, that's not true. Well, the burden of proof is on you to prove that Joe Smith does pay his taxes. So yeah, that's one approach. Is I always kind of go for the pragmatics of it.
And then we're constantly circling around the same issues, because so what I'll tell an atheist is kind of like step 1 and 2 and 3. Like, let's start here, and then let me tell you where we're going to have to end up. So one is justify your demand for evidence. After you do that, then you're going to have to tell me what would count as evidence, what would it look like, and how are you going to examine it, right? Upon what absolute premise are you going to then examine this evidence? You don't have any of that capability. Mm-hmm. You don't have it. You gave it up when you made that bed, right? You don't have a nice fluffy pillow on that bed. You just don't. You're just trying to take mine.
Yeah. That's why I say it's okay to kind of outline the argument or say, I'm not going. We can have this discussion about evidence, but first you're going to have to establish your own.
And see, again, like from the outset, I said, when dealing with atheists, the issue of God's existence is way down the line somewhere. So, for example, Given Richard Dawkins' very clear opinion about the God of the Bible, what would happen if the God of the Bible appeared to Richard Dawkins in a way that would make it impossible for Richard Dawkins to deny the fact that it is actually a God, the God, and the God of the Bible? Well, then Dawkins would hate him even more for actually existing, right? So that shows you that the issue of God's existence is not where you begin. After all, demons believe and tremble, right?
Yes.
Their issue isn't God's existence. They know 100% that he exists. Their issue is completely different. So if you hate and despise the God of the Bible, and he appeared to you, you'd hate him even more. Okay? And so that just goes to show you, it would go back to, upon what premise does Richard Dawkins reject that God's existence based on those things about his character that he doesn't like, which he doesn't like based on his own emotively subjective personal preferences du jour that are based on hidden assumptions that would need to be exposed, and then they would be exposed to be premiseless and also begging, borrowing, and stealing from our worldview. It's all just going back to the same thing.
The speaker box 123 says JP Holding Tecton TV is a good apologist YouTuber for clearing up Bible contradictions. Yes, the Tecton TV website is actually very good. He has all the alleged pagan copycats of Jesus, all in a big web page. He does exhaustive research. And
yeah, JP has been sorry.
No, I'm done.
JP has been a buddy of mine for many, many years, and I've definitely appreciated. He's the kind of guy where you read some of his serious articles, and he's like super sharp. And then you watch his videos that he makes on YouTube, where he's doing cartoon animation. So it's like he's multi-talented, but then even in the cartoon animation, he's making very serious points.
Yes. and so many of those have made me laugh out loud. But do not neglect the Tecton TV website, because that is an invaluable resource.
Yeah, and the Tecton YouTube channel.
Yes. Well, I assume most of my viewers know the Tecton TV YouTube channel.
Oh, good.
But yeah, I think this is like a good place to wrap it up. Now, you are an author. You have several books of ebooks available for download. One of which I browsed through and I got the gist of it.
Yeah, you read that the whole book. You read it today. Man, you're a quick read. Well, let me just correct one thing. My books are available on Amazon. You can buy them paperback or get them through Kindle. But it's always better to buy from independent authors. So anyone who contacts me, I'll definitely cut you a deal on the books. So I've written 4 dealing with atheism, and then like 45 other books on various topics. So yeah, one was the one I sent you, where it was reasons for being an atheist. I was just trying to help him out,
An exhaustive list, yes.
Exhausted, exhausting. And then another one is called Pop Atheist Bible Expositors, where I think, as far as I know, it's the only book actually dealing with how badly some of the most well-known atheists mishandle the Bible. And it does contain a lot of alleged contradiction resolutions. And it features Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Dan Barker, Christopher Hitchens, and the atheist Neil deGrasse Tyson. Because you remember, this is how we ended up hooking up in the first place. Is I was saying, look, Neil deGrasse Tyson does not self-identify as an atheist, but when he has made it clear by his own words that I could quote, that his goal in life is to get people to reject God, I don't care what you call yourself. It's an atheist by any other name. Use another case of use whatever Band-Aid makes you feel psychologically better. That's basically how you can be categorized, point blank.
When you read that Matt Dillahunty quote. It was so insipid. It actually reminded me of the Neil deGrasse Tyson, science is true whether you believe it or not. It's like, I want to believe as many true things as possible. I think we all pretty much do. I don't think that's anything special. But when they throw out these proclamations, there's an implied understanding that they're somehow advocating an atheist position. It's like, Neil deGrasse Tyson, well, children should be taught to think for themselves, not just accept things without evidence. Well, C.S. Lewis said the same thing, but nobody's putting that on any T-shirts.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is atheism has absolutely nothing to do with science, and science has absolutely nothing to do with atheism. But here's an idea. I think you need to host a debate between Neil deGrasse Tyson and Steakums.
Well, I'm as high profile as neither. I don't know.
But that'll make a name for you, You're the dude that hosted the debate between Neil deGrasse Tyson and Steakums.
Steakums would mop the floor with Neil.
Yeah, they already did.
Yeah. There would be no contest.
By the way, if whoever doesn't know what we're talking about, just look at Deflating Atheism's video list and you'll see instantly what we're talking about.
Yes. And so, like, it happened the first time. I said, well, I should make a video about this. And then it became too late. I kept kicking the can down the road. I said, well, okay, now it's too late. Then he did the Joe Rogan appearance wherein he lies. And the evidence is right there for everyone to see. He lies about what Steakums said. And so, okay, I can't pass this up now. Yeah.
But, okay. There's one thing about the internet you gotta love, which is the great equalizer, right?
Yeah.
You could have a guy
who's forever.
Yeah, you could have a scientist who's just at the top of his field, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and you could have whoever on earth is tweeting for Steakums just absolutely smash them, and it's like they're an equal footing to the point that poor little Neil deGrasse Tyson goes to be interviewed on a Joe Rogan show, and Rogan brings it up. Can you imagine Tyson like, man, I got to deal with these Steakum people now again?
And Joe Rogan, who I've warmed up to him a little recently, but yeah, the fact that he's so much more intellectually honest than Neil deGrasse Tyson is just speaks volumes,
Oh man, the riot.
So what are the other atheism books besides the reasons for being an atheist, the pop atheist Bible expositors?
Then there's the wild and wacky world of atheist billboards and bus ads, right? And that one, okay, the title is just meant to be kind of silly, but it is an actual serious book, and I call it a logical and theological consideration, I think it is, because there was a point in time where atheists were making sure everybody knew that they could collect together hundreds of thousands of dollars, not to actually help anybody in any way whatsoever, but just to put up billboards and bus ads to demonstrate, by golly, just how clever they considered themselves to be. And my point was, okay, let's look at all these statements you spent so much money on or wasted, and just what a logical and theological failure they were, right? And so in a way, it's a very serious book because it does deal with their claims and whether they're valid or not. And the other...
I'm sorry. What I saw on a lot of those atheist billboards are the apocryphal quotes attributed to the founding fathers that they just took from the internet and plastered on a billboard, like all the things that Thomas, it was like Benjamin Franklin. I think it was maybe a Thomas Jefferson quote they had too. And Benjamin Franklin, Christianity is the most perverted system. Well, he actually did say that. But you have to understand, he's saying it's perverted from its original intention. What he was saying. Yeah, you've seen these Thomas Jefferson quotes on the billboards.
If there's anything I've learned from atheists about American history, is that all the founding fathers were deists and agnostics and free thinkers and skeptics until we're talking about slavery. All of a sudden, they're all Bible thumping, born again evangelicals.
Great point.
So the other book is called From Zeitgeist to Poltergeist, subtitled A Consideration of Richard Dawkins' Polemics Regarding Christianity, Atheism, Communism, Nazism, and Evolution. So that's another very serious book, and a lot of it dealing with the sort of the history of ideas, and then a lot of the worldview issues behind communism and Nazism.
On that note, we'll wrap up this discussion. Please look up Ken Ammi's books.
Thank you.
Please tell us where we
can
find them.
And I want to thank the audience for their interaction. I do usually find it a little difficult to listen and speak and read the chat and maybe try to reply, but I see you guys have been active on there, and I thank you for doing so.
Yes. Very, very good comments. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all. And thank you so much, Ken, for
likewise. Thanks for having me.
Well, have a good night, everyone. God bless.
God bless. Good night.